In this lesson, our focus turns towards static malware analysis. So when you think about incident response, part of the incident response process is to identify what's happening, isolate it, and eradicate the threat. Sometimes that means that we need to better understand the threat, and in some cases, you will have the luxury of finding a piece of malware and analyzing that malware in a sandbox environment. Now, for this particular lesson and for analyzing static malware on Windows systems, I recommend that you use virtual machine software such as VirtualBox or VMware. VirtualBox is free. It works very well. The first thing you do is to back up and snapshot your virtual machine before you grab a sample piece of malware and start analyzing it. Alright, so now that we've talked about some of the lab setup here, I want to talk through some of the concepts. So, malware analysis involves exhibiting and examining the behavior of malware. And there are numerous tools that exist, some of them commercial, some of them open source, that allow us to analyze the behaviors of malware, and this can include the files that it opens, the registry modifications that it may make, the hash signatures, how it's manipulating files, and how it's interacting with the network. So once we have a tool or multiple malware analysis tools in place, then we're going to walk through the use of these tools and how we can analyze malware behavior. One of the things that we'll look at when statically analyzing malware is dependencies. As we walk through dependency analysis, what we're looking for is any DLL dependency that might exist. We're also looking to identify if there is a malware signature in place, so we might want to upload the malware, and I'll show you that. And it's also helpful to identify if the malware has been packed in such a way to avoid detection. And there are other tools such as Process Explorer that will show us exactly what processes have been spawned. And then RegShot is a tool that allows us to take a snapshot of the registry before and after running the malware executable. Alright, so I want to verify here that I have indeed snapshotted my virtual machine, because one of the next steps will be to find a piece of malware and to run it. And so once we run that malware, our virtual machine will be compromised and we'll need to roll back to a known good state. So I've gone to malshare.com. This is a fantastic site, at least with respect to finding malware for testing purposes. So I have no idea what any of these files do, and so we're going to explore the unknown together here. And we'll download this and I'll walk through real-life malware analysis, and so you can experience this as I go along, and we can learn together what this malware consists of, what it does, and how we might be able to contain it as part of the incident response process. So we're going to make sure that we have the pre-malware testing snapshot in place. Once we have that in place, then I'll feel comfortable downloading this file1.exe, and we can put some of our analysis tools in place and run it and see what happens. Now, before we run it, there are some tools that we'll want to utilize to get a static analysis, right? Because by virtue of running the file, as soon as we run it and execute it, we've moved into dynamic analysis. So static analysis is a little safer in that we're not executing the file, but we can look at maybe the contents of the binary, and we can examine that using different tools. So right now I'm going to download this piece of malware. And of course, we are getting warned that this is likely malware, and that's completely fine, at least for our purposes. All right, so we can see that we have downloaded the file. It's there. We have not run it yet. I want to copy this over into a malware directory. So now that we have the file, one of the first things that I recommend doing is uploading it to an online scanner that can utilize multiple antivirus engines simultaneously to look for malware signatures. This is much more efficient than having malware or antivirus software loaded up locally, because all these signatures are online and they are all updated. So in this case, it looks like there are 20 plus antivirus engines that we're comparing this signature against in the cloud. And not many have found it as a threat. Actually, only one of these engines has identified it as a threat, and it's been identified as a 132 executable, C++, and the Avira engine was the only one that's identified it as malware. Okay, so the next thing that I would do is to take this information and do a Google search on it to see if I can identify a description of what this malware is, at least based on the name that's been given to it by Avira antivirus. So it does appear to be documented to some extent. If we look at Avira's documentation, let's take a look and see what they say about this piece of malware. Remember, I'm going through this process in real time, so I don't have any knowledge beforehand as to what this malware is. So these instructions appear to show us that these would be the steps to get rid of it. That doesn't necessarily tell us much about the behavioral characteristics of that malware. So the TR descriptor tells us that it is a Trojan horse. So a Trojan horse, of course, is software that is installed usually via social engineering. It's supposed to be something that it's not. So before we get into dynamic analysis, there's still some additional static analysis that can be done. And one of the things we can do is do a static binary analysis and look at the code in hex format. And sometimes we can glean some information that we can see in text, in human readable text. And sometimes this might be a string within the code. Sometimes you don't find information, and sometimes if you do find information, it's not always terribly useful. So let's take a look here. So we open this up, we can see some of the grammar, and there's a lot to this tool, but really all I'm looking for right now is to see if we can find anything in clear text, and it looks like we did. It says this program cannot be run in MS-DOS mode. Okay, that doesn't necessarily tell us a whole lot, but it, if anything, tells us that it is a program that is a little bit newer. And really, we learned that already from the fact that we did the virus signature scanning in the cloud. We learned that it's a Visual C++ 32-bit executable. So here's another look at it. You can see our message here cannot be run in DOS mode, and then we see a lot of assembly language, and we can actually see some calls to some functions. Now this gives us some unique insight into potentially what the program is trying to do. So if we do a copy paste on any one of these, let's just pick one, begin paint, and we do a search on the begin paint function in Windows, because we know it's a Windows developed program. And let's see what the begin paint library or function does. Alright, so here's some sample code showing the use of begin paint. It prepares the specified window, and it looks like it paints the content of a window. So if we go in and analyze enough of this, we can really start getting a better understanding as we look through all these functions. of what this program potentially does when it's run before we even run it. And of course, the fact that we have a sandbox environment helps in that we can run it and not worry about it. So let's run it. Let's see what happens. All right, there appear to be some things happening in the background. I don't know if this will be some sort of malware that runs in the background or if we'll see anything, at least visually. So I'm going to check some processes here, see if I can find. Okay, file1.exe is running. Doesn't appear to be trying to obfuscate itself in any way. Okay, looks like it just I just tried to dump that file so we could analyze a memory dump of it. Okay, wait a minute, what's happening? Alright, so we have a screenshot here. Your documents, photos, databases, and other important files have been encrypted. If you understand the importance of this situation, this is ransomware. And ransomware, of course, is software that encrypts your data, and they will give you a URL, and they will solicit money from you in order to decrypt your information. So, all right, Kerber ransomware it appears to be. And here's some information and instructions for our poor victim. In this case, it's us. But we don't have much to be worried about because this is a simple installation of Windows that has no critical data on it. And remember, we set this up in an isolated virtual machine. So some of the other things that we would want to look at here would be to have, let's say, Snort running in the background, and to see if, now that the malware is running, and we know what the malware is, now if it's running, if there was any communication back to command and control, and likely there was, because the files and folders have been encrypted. So, as I said before, we didn't know what malware this was going to be, and now we know that it is ransomware. So, since we've got that at least rudimentary analysis out of the way, my next step is to restore back to our known good snapshot. And I just want to validate that I can restore back to that known good snapshot. And ideally I would have tested that maybe beforehand, but for our environment we'll do a real-time test to see whether or not we have a good backup. As I mentioned, we have identified it as ransomware. We did some analysis, some static analysis beforehand. We were able to get some information, but ultimately it was through running the malware that we gathered the most information. And we did this in a safe, sterile lab environment. Click on the webofsecurity.com link for the latest in cybersecurity news, test prep materials, including sample test questions, flashcards, ebooks, hands-on labs, study notes, and special offers for newly released cybersecurity training content.